Hi, everybody. My name is DJ Todd, and I'm here to talk to you today about concept testing. There are few things in this world that can kill company morale and financial performance, like spending months or years on a weak product idea. Concept testing is a tool to help you estimate the potential of a new product or a major new feature before investing expensive development resources into it. So I'll start with a brief introductory slide so you guys know who I am and, of course, why you should believe me. Next, I'll introduce some basic innovation concepts that some of you might not be familiar with, but I'll spend the bulk of the time today walking you through the concept testing process step by step. So a little bit about me. I have 20 plus years in new product development, the last 5 specializing in product innovation. I've worked primarily in software, but I've also led hardware teams and automotive product teams. I started my career as a designer, but moved to product management about 15 years ago after getting an MBA with an emphasis on innovation management. As a product manager, I've led innovation efforts at companies of all sizes. You can see on the chart up there, I've worked for big companies like HP and Verizon and Intuit. I've built a product management department from the ground up and then joined the executive team of a mid-sized company that we ultimately sold to a private equity firm. And then I've also founded and ran a startup of my own for a couple of years. Over the past few years, I've worked as a consultant specializing in product innovation, where GoDaddy was one of my primary clients. And last year, GoDaddy brought me on full-time to help them build, test, and scale an exciting new product for small business owners. I've applied the tools and methodologies I'm going to share with you today about concept testing across companies of all sizes and multiple industries. And I can honestly tell you that it has accelerated the pace and scope of innovation at every single one of those companies. So I'd imagine that almost everyone here is at least aware of Lean Startup, and some of you may have even read Eric Ries's book called Lean Startup. But for those who haven't heard of it, I think it's definitely worthwhile introducing the concepts to you because it's a big part of this whole process of concept testing. Lean Startup is a methodology designed to increase the success rate of startups, but it's not only used by startups. Larger companies have certainly adopted Lean Startup as part of their internal innovation processes. So you're likely to hear at your company the terms MVP and product market fit. Those are concepts that really come from Lean Startup. Core concept of Lean Startup is what you see on the right there, the build, measure, learn feedback loop. You start by establishing hypotheses about your customers and the needs that can be addressed by your products. Next, you build a simple early prototype called an MVP, or minimum viable product. That prototype should have the fewest features necessary to validate your business model and make it as simple as possible. Next, you run experiments with that MVP to measure its performance versus your hypotheses. And then based on those experiments, you either pivot, where you change your product or change your market and start the process all over again, or you persevere. And persevere means that you are increasing your resource commitment and starting to scale the product and continuing to run experiments. Ultimately, the goal is to get to product market fit in the least amount of time so you don't run out of money. What Lean Startup doesn't tell you and doesn't really get into much is that MVPs consume valuable design and development resources no matter how simple they are. And I've run into this issue myself multiple times. Big misses with an MVP mean big pivots and more uncertainty about the next set of hypotheses. So the bigger the pivot, the more build, measure, learn cycles it takes to ultimately get to product market fit. So most companies end up running out of money or patience after a big miss, which ultimately leads to the death of the product. Fortunately, as a product manager, there are tools that can help you reduce that risk. So the book Lean Startup is dismissive of market research, claiming it's often slow, expensive, and misleading. And I agree, formal market research can certainly be all of those things, but research in general doesn't have to be any of those things. Out of necessity, because I didn't have any research resources, I learned formal market research about 15 years ago. I've been refining my tools ever since. So while formal market research training definitely helps in this process, but you don't need it to execute the process that I'm going to explain today. So I'll walk you through it step by step here. So the third part of the process, I'm actually going to start there because that column represents the build, measure, learn feedback loop from Lean Startup that I talked about on the previous slide. If you have a truly simple MVP that takes a couple of engineers, a sprint or two to build, skip straight to step 3. You don't need to do opportunity validation or concept testing. I think the reality and what most companies find is that MVPs are rarely that simple. They usually take far more resources and far more time to build. So product managers will generally save their organization significant amounts of time and money by deploying steps 1 and 2. Step 1 is what I call opportunity validation, and it should take a product manager about a week part-time. At this phase, the product manager starts with root cause analysis. Often the customer problems that we see and perceive are just a symptom of a more important problem. So root cause analysis helps you get to that core customer problem. Once you have a handle on the core customer problem, you can generate some rough product ideas, and these don't have to be great, they don't have to be exactly accurate, but you do need something that represents a product concept. Then you'll also want to do some secondary research on competitive solutions, substitutes, and market size. Ultimately, your goal here is to determine if this opportunity is even worth pursuing. So after that 1 week of opportunity validation, you move on to concept testing if you decided that the opportunity is worth pursuing. So step 2 is what this entire presentation is all about, concept testing. By executing some simple market research, you can ensure your company doesn't waste valuable development resources on a product concept that your customers just don't have interest in. You'll be able to refine that product idea or your target market so that your product team is that much closer to product market fit before they even start to build. Okay, let's dive a little bit deeper into the reasons for concept testing. As I mentioned, concept testing helps you create an initial product concept that meets customer needs before you commit engineering resources to the MVP. So that reduces the number of build, measure, learn cycles required to get to product market fit. Concept testing also helps you identify the market segments most likely to adopt that MVP. Concept tests include demographic and firmographic questions, which we'll talk about a bit later. So you'll be able to determine which customers you should target with your early builds. A lot of us work for less than innovative companies, and if that's the case, you may need a way to convince your leadership to invest in a new product concept or in a major new feature. So by committing a few weeks yourself to a concept test, you'll be able to determine if your hypotheses about your product concept are right, and if they are, you can use your data to sell your idea internally. Lastly, product concept testing is a good building block in the development of sustainable innovation process. A lot of companies really get stuck in the incremental innovation zone, meaning they're only listening to existing customers' feedback about existing products. While incremental innovation is never bad, it certainly leaves you open to disruption from competition that's thinking about entirely new ways to solve your customers' problems. Okay, so now that we understand why we should concept test, let's walk through the process. The first step in the process is to write a research plan. If you don't have a formal research background, that's okay. It isn't rocket science. Let's start with a problem statement. What is the hypothetical customer problem that you're trying to solve? Here's an example of a 3-part problem statement that I put together for a project a few years ago. There's 3 things going on here. We're talking about fleet managers and fleet management companies. So there was 3 things we saw. There was information overload. They're struggling to make the most of the data that's available to them. There's just too much of it. There's insufficient employee training, meaning the employees of companies are not really trained to use the tools, their existing fleet management tools. And then problem identification is all about managers not having the bandwidth or training to proactively identify problems or opportunities hidden in their fleet data. So all of those are 3 parts of a pretty complex problem statement. You may have a much simpler problem statement. That's okay. I think the most important thing to take away from problem statement is don't get into solutions. Just focus on the problem. The next part of the research plan is hypotheses. So based on what you know today, what do you believe? So you'll test those hypotheses with your survey and your market research. Here's a couple of examples from the same research project. So let's look at the second and third. Voice is more valuable than chat for drivers and field service personnel. So I have questions in my survey specifically designed to answer and address that hypothesis. Next one, an assistant that proactively identifies and communicates problems and opportunities is significantly more valuable than a passive assistant. Again, it means I'll have a question specifically addressing that hypothesis in my survey. You may only have one hypothesis. This particular project had 6 or 7. It really depends on the project scope. All that's important here is that you actually do write out your hypotheses. The next step is to capture your objectives. So not everything is going to fall neatly into your hypotheses. So with objectives, all you're going to do is capture the other things that you want to learn in your survey, that you really need to learn in your survey. This step is very important because all of your questions that you write for the survey later on will tie specifically to your hypotheses and your objectives. You don't want to just start writing questions because they're nice to have in your survey, because then you'll overload the participants and you'll get fatigue, survey fatigue, and your data quality will suffer. So write your hypotheses and objectives down first, and then make sure later when you're writing the survey that it does not do anything more or less than what you have already captured in your hypotheses and problems. Final step of the research plan is to capture your participant profile and tools. And what that step is doing is narrowing down the exact audience for your survey. In this example, I was using an external research panel of fleet managers and operators that were specifically recruited for our company. But right now I'm working on a concept test for GoDaddy that has much more specific requirements. So right now I'm looking at recruiting small business owners with less than 10 employees in the US only, and they have the goal of growing their business over the next calendar year. So that's the example of much more specificity when it comes to defining your participant profile. I typically build my surveys in Google Docs or Word, then refine, build, and test them in SurveyMonkey. But you can use whatever tool that your company uses for research, simple research. You typically want 400 or more responses to get to statistical significance, but sometimes that's just not possible. You see my survey here, if you look at respondents, it's 150 total. And that's because we were recruiting managers of small business vehicle fleets, which is a super narrow audience. So if you work in an industry that has a super narrow audience like that, you can lower that number to less than 400. It's not a big deal. Just know that when you're analyzing your data later, you have to be more general with your conclusions, because you're not going to have enough data points to draw really specific conclusions. Okay, so that's the end of the research plan. Once you write that research plan, you need a product concept that you can share with your research participants. There's really a good, better, best approach here when putting together a product concept. The good, or the kind of lowest possible solution, is just a simple text description. And honestly, I've had to use these many times just because I had very severe limitations on resources or time. They're okay, but your data is only as good as your participants' understanding of the concept. So if you are using a written product concept only, you may want to include a question that explicitly asks the user how well they understand the concept, so you can filter out the questionable data on the back end. So if a user says, hey, I didn't really understand the concept, you may want to throw that data out. What's better than a basic written text description is to include images. I've certainly built diagrams in PowerPoint and Photoshop and concepts in Photoshop, but sometimes even a basic stock image can really help. So an example of that is this Google Home image you see on this slide. I was doing a concept test about personal digital assistants, and just that basic stock image helped participants relate what I was talking about to something that they already understood. The best approach, if you have some great creator resources in your company, is an explanatory video. I'm sure you guys have seen these where they're the 30-second animated videos to explain kind of a more complex concept. Those are great. The comprehension of the product is going to be much higher if you can do one of those, but I understand it's not always possible. So just know that there are 3 different ways to go about doing a product concept, and it really depends on the time and complexity of your concept. So let's move on to the third step, which is actually writing the survey. I highly recommend taking an online course in survey design if you have the time, because there's far more rules and tips to designing great surveys than I can possibly cover in a half-an-hour presentation. But as far as the structure of that survey, there's typically 4 sections. I start with screeners. These are easy questions that you start with to make sure you're limiting your responses to your target audience. So a couple of examples you see here. I wanted specifically small business owners. So I had a question that talked about a bunch of other things like nonprofit founders, people with full or part-time jobs who have a side business. I didn't care about those people. So I specifically excluded them from the survey, or I disqualified them using skip logic in my survey. Second question is the same way. I wanted self-employed full-time business owners. So that first answer was all I wanted. So all of the other respondents who answered anything else on that question would have been disqualified. Next, you'll want to dive into current behavior or preferences. So if you think back to a couple slides ago, I said when you do your concept test and then you do your objectives are currently going to translate into your questions about current behaviors and preferences. These can be covered just about anything. It's really anything you want to learn outside of your core concept. So a couple of examples here. What do you currently use to manage information about your customers and prospects out of the software packages below? Or approximately what percentage of your fleet vehicles are equipped with touchscreen infotainment systems? Two different projects there, but these are the types of questions you'll be asking in this section, current behaviors and preferences. The third part of the survey is kind of the meat and potatoes, which is the concept test itself. You'll use the product concept that you created earlier that I was talking about a few slides ago, whether it's text with images, or video. You'll introduce that concept to the participants in the survey, and then you have to write some questions afterwards. And your question should focus on value to the customer, typically on a 5-point Likert scale. So some of you may not be familiar with Likert scales, but there's a good example of it right here on this screen. So that question down there below, in your opinion, how valuable do you believe these infotainment tools would be to your business? So there's 5 points on that. That's a Likert scale question. So extremely valuable all the way down to not at all valuable. You may have multiple questions to measure value on your concept tests. I only put one up here, but many of my concept tests include up to 5 or 6 different questions about value. I may even show multiple concepts in a concept test. All right, so the last part of writing and deploying the survey is about demographics. So you're going to want some easy demographic questions to kind of close out the survey. You'll use the data that you collect at the end of the survey to really segment your customers in the analysis phase. So that may be age, gender, geography, simple things like that. Or you see question 18 up there on the top. You may dig into things that are a little bit more meaningful to you, like what is the company's growth intent for the upcoming calendar year? It's up to you to collect whatever kind of demographics you want. Just know that those are the questions you're going to use to segment your audience on the back end to help you kind of narrow down who you should be focusing on. So now that you've written it, that brings us to the final stage of the concept test process, which is analysis. Obviously, the value questions that you asked are going to be very exciting. You're going to want to dive right into those, but they really have limited value if you don't filter them by customer segment. So use your demographic and behavioral questions that you asked to segment your concept test results. Identify, take note of customer segments that find your product concepts significantly more or less valuable than average. That's super interesting data, and good examples what you see up here in this chart. You can see each of those color bars correspond to a different customer segment. So the dark blue bar is the total response rate. So this particular concept performed really well, but you see the yellow bar is enterprise or very large business customers. They responded with a much higher rate of interest than all the other segments. So obviously it would make sense to build an MVP focused on that particular customer segment. So how do you know if your concept is actually resonating with your customer segment? I use a concept called top 2 box to evaluate that. Top 2 box is the percentage of respondents who say that the product concept would be very or extremely valuable to them. If you're using that 5-point Likert scale that I recommended on the previous slide, 80% is typically the magic number. So 80% of your respondents said that it was very or extremely valuable to them. So I've deployed about 20 of these concept tests over the past 5 years, and the concepts that have a top 2 box score of 80% or higher are typically worth moving forward in the innovation process. Few concepts will score 80% across all segments. So again, I can't reinforce this enough. Identify those customer segments that find your concept most valuable. Again, this chart shows that enterprise-sized companies found the most value in this particular product concept. That's what those yellow bars are again. While individual owner-operators, those teal bars, you see that's a much lower score and falls below the threshold that we would have needed to say that this was going to be a promising concept. So again, make sure that you segment your results. So the next stage in the analysis phase is to revisit your hypotheses. If you built your survey correctly, all of your hypotheses should have been addressed. Explicitly write down how each of those hypotheses performed, whether it was validated, proven false, or inconclusive. Obviously, inconclusive is not what you're going for. You ultimately want to either prove or disprove your hypotheses, but sometimes the data is inconclusive, and there's not much you can do about that. Hypothesis validation is just another tool to help you decide if you should proceed, and if so, what customer segments you should target. And then finally, you need to draw conclusions. Based on your top 2 box scores, based on your hypothesis validation, answer the following 3 questions. Number 1, Should the company continue to pursue this product concept? If it scored 60%, probably not. If it scored 90%, definitely. If so, what should the MVP look like? What customer segments were most promising? So that's really the third core question. What are the core customer segments that we should target with this MVP? So 3 questions again. Should we continue to pursue the product concept? What should the MVP look like? And then what customer segment should we target with that MVP? Okay, now that your product concept test is complete, you need to decide what to do. Like, how do you proceed at this point? Concept test well, meaning you scored 80, 90, 95%, by all means, commit development resources to the MVP because you got great data to suggest that you are on the right track. Doesn't mean you're done. You're going to have to still create a new set of hypotheses and evolve your concept, and you're going to have to keep experimenting, but you're formally into the build, measure, learn loop at that point. A lot of times you're going to get mixed test results where you're going to be a little bit below 80%, or the product concept resonates with a particular market segment that isn't very large or isn't going to generate a lot of revenue for you. In that case, there's a couple of different approaches you could take. The first one is to evaluate other product concepts. Hopefully you have other ideas in your funnel and other product concepts that you can then go look at as alternatives to this one. That's definitely a good approach. Say, okay, this one didn't do so great. We're going to set it aside. We're going to test some other concepts and see how they do. Second approach that you can take here is just to learn from your research and then modify your concept and try again. You may see that our product concept was close, but was really off on one particular feature or one particular aspect of your product just wasn't right, or you weren't quite right with the target segment that you were pursuing. You may just want to modify your concept and then try this whole process again. The third thing you can do there is to redeploy later. And I've had this happen twice, I think, 2 times out of the last 20, where you get your data back and there's some promise in the data, but it shows that the market just isn't quite ready. In that case, you probably just want to put that concept on the shelf, come back and retest it in a year or 2, and then see if the market has evolved to catch up. And then finally, what happens if you get poor test results? That is not a bad thing, guys, believe me. That is just where you say, let's say you scored a 40 or something. Scrap the idea and celebrate. At least you didn't spend a ton of time and resources going out and building something that people didn't want. You just saved your company a ton of money. Okay, so that should wrap up the course here, their introduction to concept testing. I know you guys will probably have some questions about the details of execution here, and you may want to see some more examples, and I can certainly help you out with that. Feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn. My profile is right there on the screen.